The Supremacy of Uruguay by E.B. White. 15 years after the peace had been made at Versailles, Uruguay came into possession of a fine military secret. It was an invention, in effect so simple, in construction so cheap, that there was not the slightest doubt that it would enable Uruguay to subdue any or all of the other nations of the earth. Naturally, the 2 or 3 statesmen who knew about it saw visions of aggrandizement, and although there was nothing in history to indicate that a large country was any happier than a small one, they were very anxious to get going. The inventor of the device was a Montevideo hotel clerk named Martin Casablanca. He had got the idea for the thing during 1933 mayoralty campaign in New York City, where he was attending a hotel men's convention. One November evening, shortly before election, he was wandering in the Broadway district and came upon a street rally. A platform had been erected on a marquee by one of the theaters, and in the interval between speeches, a cold young man in an overcoat was singing into a microphone. "Thanks," he crooned, "for all the lovely delight I found in your embrace." The inflection of the love words was that of a murmurous voice, but the volume of the amplified sound was enormous. It carried for blocks deep into the ranks of the electorate. The Uruguayan paused. He was not unfamiliar with the delight of a love embrace, but in his experience it had been pitched lower, more intimate, concentrated. This sprawling public sound had a curious effect on him. "And thanks for the unforgettable nights I never can replace." People swayed around him in the so-bright corner, in the too crowded press of bodies. The dominant and searching booming of the love singer struck sharp into him, and he became, for a few seconds, as he later realized, a loony man. The faces, the face masks, the chill air, the advertising lights, the steam rising from the jumbo cup of A&P coffee high over 47th Street, these added to his enchantment and his unbalance. At any rate, when he left and walked away from Times Square and the great slimy sounds of the love embrace, this was the thought that was in his head. If it unhinged me to hear such a soft crooning sound slightly amplified, what might it not do to me to hear a far greater sound, greatly amplified? Mr. Casablanca stopped. "Good Christ," he whispered to himself, and his own whisper frightened him, as though it too had been amplified. Chucking his convention, he sailed for Uruguay the following afternoon. 10 months later, he had perfected and turned over to his government a war machine unique in military history. A radio-controlled plane carrying an electric phonograph with a retractable streamlined horn. Casablanca had got hold of Uruguay's loudest tenor and had recorded the bar of music he had heard in Times Square. "Thanks," screamed the tenor, "for unforgettable nights I never can replace." Casablanca prepared to step it up 150,000 times and groove the record so it would repeat the phrase endlessly. His theory was that a squadron of pilotless planes, scattering this unendurable sound over foreign territories, would immediately reduce the populace to insanity. Then Uruguay, at her leisure, could send in her armies, subdue the idiots, and annex the land. It was a most engaging prospect. The world at this time was drifting rapidly into a nationalistic phase. The incredible cancers of the World War had been forgotten. Armaments were being rebuilt. Hate and fear sat in every citadel. The Geneva gesture had been prolonged, but only by dint of removing the seat of disarmament to a walled city on a neutral island and quartering the delegates in the waiting destroyers of their respective countries. The Congress of the United States had appropriated another $100 million for her naval program. Germany had expelled the Jews and recast the steel of her helmets in a firmer mold, and the world was reliving the 1914 prologue. Uruguay waited till she thought the moment was at hand and then struck. Over the slumberous hemispheres by night sped swift gleaming planes, and there fell upon all the world, except Uruguay, a sound the equal of which had never been heard on land or sea. The effect was as Casablanca had predicted. In 48 hours, the people were hopelessly mad, ravaged by an interdictable noise. Ears shattered, minds unseated. No defense had been possible because, the minute anyone came within range of the sound, he lost his sanity, and being daft, proved ineffectual in a military way. After the planes had passed over, life went on much as before, except that it was more secure. Sanity being gone, no one could hear anything except the noise in his own head. At the actual moment when people had been smitten with the noise, there had been, of course, some rather amusing incidents. A lady in West Philadelphia happened to be talking to her butcher on the phone. "Thanks," she had just said, "for taking back that tough steak yesterday, and thanks," she added as the phone passed over, "for the unforgettable night I can never replace." Linotype operators in composing rooms chopped off in the middle of sentences, like the one who was setting a story about an admiral in San Pedro. "I am tremendously grateful to all the ladies of San Pedro for the wonderful hospitality they have shown the men of the fleet during our recent maneuvers, and thanks for the unforgettable nights I never can replace, and thanks for the unforgettable nights I never..." To all appearances, Uruguay's conquest of the earth was complete. There remained, of course, the formal occupation by her armed forces, that her troops, being in possession of all their facilities, or of all their faculties, could establish her supremacy among idiots. She never for a moment doubted. She assumed that with nothing but lunacy to combat the occupation would be mildly stimulating and enjoyable. She supposed her crazy foes would do a few rather funny, picturesque things with their battleships and their tanks, and then surrender. What she failed to anticipate was that her foes, being mad, had no intention of making war at all. The occupation proved bloodless and singularly unimpressive. A detachment of her troops landed in New York, for example, and took up quarters in the RKO building, which was fairly empty at the time. And they were no more conspicuous around town than the Knights of Pythias. One of her battleships steamed for England, and the commanding officer grew so enraged when no hostile ship came out to engage him that he sent a wireless, which of course nobody in England heard. "Come on out, you yellow-bellied rats." It was the same story everywhere. Uruguay's supremacy was never challenged by her silly subjects, and she was very little noticed. Territorially, her conquest was magnificent. Politically, it was a fiasco. The people of the world paid slight attention to the Uruguayans, and the Uruguayans, for their part, were bored by many of their territorials, in particular by Lithuanians whom they couldn't stand. Everywhere, crazy people lived happily as children. In their heads, the old refrain, "And thanks for unforgettable nights." Billions dwelt contentedly in a fool's paradise. The earth was bountiful, and there was peace and plenty. Uruguay gazed at her vast dominion and saw the whole incident lacked authenticity. It wasn't till years later, when the descendants of some early American idiots grew up and regained their senses, that there was a wholesale return of sanity to the world. Land and sea forces were restored to fighting strength, and the avenging struggle was begun, which eventually involved all the races of the earth, crushed Uruguay, and destroyed mankind without a trace. The end.